I was 17, a Tuesday morning, and I remember waking up to an empty house, which wasn't entirely out of the ordinary, considering my parents worked long shifts, and my brother often crashed at his friend's place. But there was a silence. That morning, a kind of stillness that made the air feel too heavy, too final, like the world had paused and I hadn't gotten the memo. And when I shuffled to the kitchen, eyes still sticky with sleep, I found the note taped to the fridge, my name written in rushed, almost shaky penmanship, and as I opened it, the words hit me like a truck. You'll figure it out. That was it. No explanation, no we're sorry, no we love you. Just 4 words on a piece of paper that shattered everything I thought I knew about family, and I stood there for what felt like hours. Barefoot on cold tile, heart thudding in a rhythm that didn't belong to calm or confusion, but pure abandonment. Because no matter how much we fought, no matter how imperfect things were, I never believed they'd actually leave me behind like I was some inconvenience they could toss out like garbage. And for the next hour, I walked through the house in a daze, checking every room, expecting to find bags or clues, or maybe even hear someone yell surprise and tell me it was some cruel joke, but everything was gone. Clothes, toothbrushes, the stupid cactus on the windowsill my mom used to water, religiously vanished like they'd never lived here at all. And I wanted to scream, but my throat locked up, my mind spiraled, and I couldn't even cry. Because how do you process something that big in real time? How do you go from having a family to having nothing in the span of a night? And when I tried calling them, my mom's phone was disconnected, my dad's just rang endlessly, and my brother, he'd blocked me, like I was some stalker begging for scraps of attention, and the friends I thought I had either gave me pity looks or turned away, their parents whispering things behind their backs like maybe I'd done something to deserve this. Like maybe I was the problem. Like maybe the fact that I didn't get straight A's or didn't smile enough or talked back too much meant I should be punished with solitude. And I remember going to school the next day because I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want to sit in that hollow shell of a home alone, and when I told the counselor, she nodded too politely and handed me a stack of pamphlets, talking about shelters and youth support programs, and temporary assistance, as if my life had become a brochure, as if a mattress in a shared room with strangers and a meal ticket could fix the kind of broken that comes from your own blood. Deciding you're no longer worth keeping, and I tried staying for as long as I could, heating up canned soup, wearing the same clothes on repeat, rationing what little I had left in my savings from a part-time job at the gas station. But the bills came fast, and the silence grew louder, and I started missing things like the way my mom hummed while folding laundry, or the smell of my dad's aftershave in the hallway, or even the sound of my brother blasting music too loud. It wasn't that they were good memories necessarily, but they were pieces of something I used to belong to, and I held on to them like driftwood in a storm. Because even if they weren't perfect, they were mine, and now I didn't even have that. And it all hit me one night when the power went out because I hadn't paid the bill, and I sat in the darkness, curled on the floor in the only blanket I had left, the cold seeping into my bones like the loneliness I couldn't shake. And I cried for hours, ugly, gasping sobs that hurt more than any physical wound. And I kept asking why, over and over, like maybe the universe owed me an answer. Like maybe if I could just understand what I did wrong, I could undo it, I could make it right. But no one came, no one explained. And the note stayed stuck to the fridge like a cruel reminder that I'd been left to fend for myself. A ghost in my own life, invisible and forgotten. And as days bled into weeks, I started walking the city at night, not because I had anywhere to go, but because movement felt better than stillness. And one night I met this guy, older, scruffy, the kind of person who'd seen too much and smiled too little. And he offered me a cigarette and asked why a kid like me looked so damn lost. And I told him the truth. Not because I trusted him, but because I needed to say it out loud, needed to hear how ridiculous it all sounded. But instead of laughing, he just nodded and said, "Yeah, that'll mess you up for life." And then he handed me his sandwich, told me to eat, and we sat in silence on a bench while the city breathed around us. And I realized in that moment that maybe strangers could care more than your own flesh and blood, and that scared me more than anything else, because if family wasn't permanent, if love could be turned off like a switch, then what was the point of trying to belong to anything, or anyone ever again? And now, sitting here years later, on the other side of it all, in a space I call home, not because someone else provided it, but because I built it myself, brick by trembling brick, late night after late night, writing, working, healing, I look around at the quiet comfort of my apartment. The bookshelf overflowing with stories, some mine, some borrowed. The couch I picked out secondhand, that still creaks when I sit on it. The old mug on the windowsill filled with half daisies gifted by a student who once told me, "You remind me that people survive." And I think about that note again. Those 4 words that shattered a 17-year-old kid's world. And I realize I don't feel hate anymore. Not even anger, just a kind of profound sadness for the people who walked away from me, because they'll never know the version of me that exists now. The version that gets emails from teenagers saying my story gave them the courage to ask for help. The version that speaks on panels about youth, homelessness, and generational trauma. The version that wakes up every day and chooses to stay, not because it's easy, but because the alternative isn't even an option anymore. And there's something holy in that. Something sacred in realizing you are no longer the victim of your story, but the author of it, pen in hand, rewriting every page they tried to, ripped from your soul. And sometimes I wonder if they ever think about me, if my mother pauses at a red light and remembers the sound of my laugh, or if my father lies awake at night haunted by the image of his youngest child sitting alone on the kitchen floor with a note in hand and no explanation, or if my brother scrolls through social media and sees my name attached to articles and essays and quietly wonders how I survived without them. And maybe that's why they stay silent. Maybe it's easier for them to pretend I don't exist and to confront the truth of what they did, and I've made peace with that. Not because it didn't hurt, but because healing means learning that closure doesn't come from the people who broke you. It comes from the strength to stop bleeding for them, to stop handing them the knife again and again. And I don't need their apologies, because I've already given myself everything they refuse to. Safety, stability, kindness, love, and the right to take up space. And now, when I stand in front of a classroom filled with kids who've been hurt in the same silent, invisible ways, I tell them the truth. I tell them family isn't always blood. That sometimes it's the people who see your pain and stay anyway. Sometimes it's the friend who picks you up at 2 a.m., or the librarian who remembers your name, or the stranger who hands you a sandwich on a cold night and calls you kid-like. It means something, and, when I say it, their eyes light up with that quiet, fragile kind of hope. And I know they believe me, because I've lived it. And even now, when I walk past mirrors, I don't see that scared 17-year-old anymore. I see someone who made it, someone who clawed their way out of abandonment and turned it into belonging. And I still write, late into the night, the way I used to when the world felt too heavy. But now the words come softer, not desperate, not pleading, but whole. And one night last winter I printed that original note for the last time, framed it, and hung it above my desk not as a wound, but as a reminder that I did figure it out, not because they believed in me, but because I learned to believe in myself. And every time someone reads my story, every time a trembling hand reaches out for help and finds it, I know those 4 words were never a curse. They were a challenge, and I met it, and I won. But the thing about healing is that it isn't linear. It doesn't ask permission before it pulls you back under. And for every step forward I took, there were days I found myself staring out the window, wondering if they even remembered my birthday. Wondering if they told people they had 2 kids, or if I was erased from every family photo like I never existed. And it was worse during the holidays. Especially the first Thanksgiving, when Emily invited me to join her extended family, and I said, yes, hoping it would feel warm and full and safe. But as soon as I saw the long table, and the laughter, and the way her cousins joked with their mom without flinching, I felt this cold crawl up my spine, because I couldn't stop comparing everything to what I never had, or maybe what I had and lost. And I spent most of the evening pretending to smile, pushing mashed potatoes around my plate while trying not to cry in front of strangers. And afterward, when Emily found me sitting on the porch, wrapped in her dad's oversized jacket, she didn't say anything at first. She just sat beside me in silence, and then she said, "You don't have to pretend here." And I broke, not dramatically, not loudly, but in that quiet way that hurts even more, tears slipping down without force, like they'd been waiting for the right crack to spill through. And I told her I didn't know how to belong anywhere, that even when people were kind, I felt like I was holding my breath, waiting to be kicked out again. And she just said, "Then we'll teach your lungs to breathe differently." And that sentence stuck with me. It sounded ridiculous at the time, but over the weeks that followed, I understood what she meant. Belonging isn't a place you land. It's something you build inside yourself brick by shaky brick, until one day you don't flinch when someone says you're part of the family. And I started to see small changes in myself, like how I stopped apologizing every time I asked for help, or how I laughed without immediately checking to see if anyone was annoyed, or how I looked in the mirror and saw someone growing into their skin instead of someone shrinking to fit into other people's boxes. And it wasn't perfect. There were still moments I panicked over nothing, like when a professor sent me an email that just said we need to talk, and I spiraled into thinking I'd failed or disappointed someone again. But when I showed up to his office bracing for rejection, he smiled and told me my last essay had been so honest it gave him goosebumps, and he asked if I'd consider submitting it to a national competition for survivors of family trauma. And I said yes, not because I thought I'd win, but because it felt like one more way to reclaim my voice. One more way to prove to myself that I didn't need their validation to matter. And that submission turned into something bigger than I could have imagined. Because not only did I win a scholarship, but my story got published online. And suddenly people were reaching out, kids who said they felt less alone. Parents who promised to never treat their children the way mine treated me. Teachers who said they'd read my piece to their students. And I realized then that maybe all that pain hadn't been pointless. Maybe if my words could help even one person feel seen, it made everything I endured mean something. And when I got the acceptance letter to transfer into a 4-year university for the fall, I cried alone in my apartment. But this time they were the kind of tears that tasted like victory, like defiance, like survival wasn't just breathing, it was thriving. It was building something sacred from the pieces of your own wreckage. And I thought about calling them, about dialing my mom's number and saying, "Look at me now." But then I asked myself who that call was really for, and I realized I didn't need to prove anything to them, because they'd never get it. They'd never see the nights I slept on benches, the moments I wanted to disappear, the strangers who fed me more love than they ever did. And if they couldn't see my worth when I was 17 and terrified, then they didn't deserve a glimpse of the person I'd become. And I let that thought settle like dust. Not with bitterness, but with clarity, and I deleted the old contacts. From my phone, I threw away the note for real this time. Not out of anger, but as a symbol that I didn't need their words to define me anymore. And I began writing my own stories, essays, short fiction, poems about kids who find family in the most unexpected places, about hope wrapped in cardboard, about the quiet strength of survival, and every time I wrote, I felt more whole, more me, more connected to the version of myself that had been buried beneath all that pain. And I started hosting small workshops in the community center downtown, teaching other youth how to use writing as a way to process their own stories. And one afternoon, a girl about 16 with nervous eyes and a backpack too heavy for her shoulders handed me a crumpled piece of paper and said, "I wrote this after reading your story." And as I read her words, raw and trembling, about being kicked out for loving the wrong person, I felt something deep and fierce stir in my chest, not just empathy, but pride, because she was doing what I had done, turning pain into power. And I told her she was brave, and I meant it with my whole soul, because I knew exactly what it cost to bleed onto a page and still keep walking forward. And in that moment, I saw myself not just as a survivor, but as someone who could light the way for others. Someone who had taken the sentence, "You'll figure it out," and transformed it into something beautiful, something alive, something strong enough to carry more than just my own weight. But building something new from ashes isn't as romantic as people make it sound. It's not this grand awakening where the sun rises and you suddenly know who you are. It's slow, it's messy, it's doubting yourself every other breath. It's waking up in the middle of the night panicked that everything will be taken from you again, even though no one said anything, even though the people around you have done nothing but show you they care. And I remember those early mornings working at a thrift store downtown, sorting through bags of donated clothes with musty smells and hidden stories, and I'd get lost wondering what kind of person wore this dress, or who outgrew that pair of sneakers. And it helped distract me from the aching question I still hadn't answered: why me? Why had my own family looked at me and decided I wasn't worth keeping? And even though the therapist said not everything has a reason, that some people are just damaged, I couldn't stop picking at that scab. Like if I just remembered something they said, some sign I missed, I could finally make peace with it. But peace doesn't come easy when your heart still flinches every time someone raises their voice or takes too long to text back. And I started noticing how deep the wounds went when Emily's mom once asked me to set the table, and I froze, paralyzed by the fear that if I did it wrong, she'd tell me to leave. And she noticed, of course, she noticed, and she walked over, gently placed her hand on mine and whispered, "You're safe here." And I had to excuse myself because I didn't want them to see me cry over something as small as forks and knives. But it wasn't about the silverware. It was about the fact that kindness still felt like a trick, like the rug was always waiting to be pulled out, and it made me feel so ashamed, like I was broken in a way that couldn't be fixed. But every day I stayed, every meal they shared with me, every time Emily knocked on my door just to say goodnight, it chipped away at the fortress I'd built inside, the one made of silence and shame. And I started to trust them, not all at once, not perfectly, but enough to let them see pieces of who I used to be. The kid who liked to write stories in spiral notebooks, the kid who used to dream about being a teacher, and they didn't laugh or roll their eyes, they encouraged it. Emily even gave me one of her old laptops so I could start writing again, and I'd sit by the window some evenings, fingers flying over keys, pouring out every ghost, every scar, every version of myself I'd tried to bury. And it felt like breathing after being underwater too long. And one day I wrote about the note, not just what it said, but how it made me feel. And when I read it out loud in a community writing group, I was shaken the entire time. But when I finished, no one looked away. No one told me to move on or suck it up. They clapped, some even cried. And someone came up afterward and said, "That was the most honest thing I've ever heard." And I felt something crack open inside, like maybe my pain could be something more than just a wound. Maybe it could be a bridge. Maybe my story could make someone else feel less alone. And that idea stayed with me, lingered even as I got my GED, even as I applied to local colleges, even as I moved into a tiny studio apartment with more cockroaches than floor space. Because for the first time in my life, I was building something on my own terms, not as someone's disappointment, not as someone's burden, but as someone who survived. And I started calling myself that survivor, not to erase the pain, but to honor the fact that I was still here despite it. And yes, there were setbacks. There were nights I couldn't sleep, days I couldn't eat, triggers I didn't expect, like someone yelling in the hallway or a smell that reminded me of home. But I got through them, sometimes by texting Emily at 2 a.m., sometimes by rereading my own writing like lifelines on a page. And eventually, I stopped waiting for an apology that would never come. I stopped checking my old email to see if they'd written. I stopped rehearsing what I'd say if I ever saw them again, because I realized I didn't owe them closure, and they didn't deserve access to the version of me I was becoming, the version that laughed again, that made new friends, that got accepted into a community college with a full scholarship for writing an essay about resilience. And when I walked across that campus for the first time, backpack over my shoulder, surrounded by strangers who didn't know a thing about my past, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope, not the kind you cling to in desperation, but the quiet, steady kind that tells you maybe, just maybe, the worst is behind you. And I still carry that note with me, not because I need to relive the pain, but because it reminds me of what I overcame. Because every time I look at it, I hear a different voice nod. There's been mine, and it doesn't say you'll figure it out like a curse anymore. It says it like a promise, like a vow I made to myself the day I was left behind. And I kept it. I kept it every damn day since. So I stayed on that bench longer than I should have, just chewing that sandwich like it was my first real meal in days, because it was. And I remember how each bite hurt my throat because I'd been holding so much inside for so long. And after he left, he didn't ask for anything, didn't even tell me his name. I just watched him disappear into the night like a figment of something good I wasn't sure I deserved. And that became a pattern for a while. These small, strange acts of kindness from people who owed me nothing. The guy who ran the corner mart slipping me a banana and a bottle of water when I lingered too long near the back. The lady who drove the city bus and let me ride for free when she saw me shivering at the stop too many nights in a row. The elderly woman in the park who asked if I was lost and pressed a 20 into my palm like she knew I wouldn't take it unless it was disguised as a favor. And every one of them made me ache in a different way, because they were giving me something my own parents never thought to, just the basic human decency of being seen. And yet I still kept telling myself that maybe they'd come back. Maybe this was some kind of twisted lesson they were trying to teach me, and if I just survived long enough, they'd reappear and say, "See, you're stronger now," like that would somehow justify the trauma. But deep down I knew better, because bills don't wait for apologies, and hunger doesn't care about reasons. And after I missed too many school days, I was dropped from enrollment. Just like that, my dreams of college folding in on themselves like paper in the rain. And when I tried going back to the house one day after sleeping on a friend's couch too many nights in a row, I found the locks had been changed. A notice nailed to the front door saying the property had been vacated and reclaimed. And I stood there on the porch with my only backpack in hand, the wind slicing through my jacket like it was nothing. And I realized the only place I ever called home had evicted me both physically and emotionally. And I was truly, completely alone. And I wish I could say I rose from that moment, that something inside me snapped into strength. But the truth, as I broke quietly, invisibly, in ways no one saw, and I started doing things I swore I never would, taking shifts at a diner, under the table, letting men twice my age pay me to sit with them while they talked about their crumbling marriages and empty houses, telling myself I wasn't doing anything wrong because I needed the cash, and this was the only thing left between me and the streets. And every time I stared into the mirror afterward, I felt less like a person and more like a shell stitched together with shame and survival. And I began to forget things, what day it was, how it felt to laugh, the sound of my mother's voice, because when you're in survival mode for too long, you trade pieces of yourself for safety and don't even realize they're gone until someone asks you a simple question like, "What's your favorite movie?" And you freeze because you don't remember the last time you saw one. And the days became blurred copies of each other, the same desperation, the same numbness. Until one night I was caught stealing a sandwich from the back of a convenience store, and the owner, this big angry guy with tired eyes, grabbed my arm and yelled. And I remember thinking, this is it, this is where it ends. But instead of calling the cops, he sighed, asked how old I was, and when I told him, he shook his head and said, "Jesus Christ, kid," before handing me the sandwich and telling me not to come back. And I ate it behind a dumpster with tears running down my face. Not because I was afraid, but because I was so used to punishment that kindness felt alien, like a language I'd forgotten how to speak. And that's when I realized I couldn't keep doing this, couldn't keep drifting through life like I was already dead. And I remembered a girl I used to sit behind in math class, Emily, who always carried too many books and smiled like the world hadn't hurt her yet. And I found her on social media one night using free Wi-Fi outside a library, and I sent her a message I didn't expect her to respond to, just 3 words, "I need help." And when she replied an hour later with, "Where are you?" I started to cry, not because I believed rescue was coming, but because someone had finally asked. Someone had noticed I existed. And when she showed up in her mom's old minivan the next morning, eyes wide and worried, she didn't judge, didn't ask for the whole story, she just let me in, handed me a blanket and a bottle of water, and said, "You can stay for a few nights." And that was the first time in months I slept without one eye open, the first time I woke up to the smell of pancakes instead of anxiety, and I sat at their kitchen table like I didn't belong, because part of me believed I didn't. But her mom just patted my hand and asked if I liked maple syrup, and I wanted to cry again. Because how could a stranger care more about whether I liked syrup than my own mother cared about whether I ate it all? And over those few nights I started to talk, little bits at a time, about the note, the house, the jobs, and the people who handed me kindness like coins. And they listened, really listened. And when the few nights turned into a few weeks, I started to remember how it felt to be human again, how it felt to laugh, to want things, to imagine a tomorrow, and it was terrifying. Because when you've been abandoned once, every new connection feels like a ticking clock. Like it'll vanish the moment you breathe too deeply. But Emily and her mom never made me feel like a burden. They never asked me to leave. And eventually they helped me apply for my GED, find a part-time job that didn't ask too many questions, and get a cheap therapy program through a local nonprofit. And it was in that windowless room with a woman who wore floral scarves and too much perfume that I said it out loud for the first time. They didn't love me enough to stay. And she didn't correct me, didn't try to fix it. She just nodded and said, "And that wasn't your fault." And that sentence echoed in my brain like a bell, loud and jarring. Because I'd never considered that maybe the problem wasn't me. Maybe I wasn't too hard to love, too loud, too moody, too much of anything. Maybe they were just incapable, broken in ways they refused to fix. And I carried that sentence with me like armor, repeating it in my head every time I felt the old ghosts pulling me back. Every time I saw a mother hugging her kid, or heard someone say family is everything. Because for me, family had been the wound, not the bandage. And the only way forward was to build my own sense of home, brick by careful brick.